You've hit play on the Screen Companion, an eclectic mix of film and TV recommendations. Today we're doing court movies. 12 Angry Men from 1957, Presumed Innocent from 1990, and My Cousin Vinny from 1992. In Presumed Innocent, prosecutor Rusty Savage is given the case of an apparent rape murder of Carolyn Polhemus. This will be a difficult one for him to oversee, for not only was Carolyn a fellow prosecutor, but they previously had an affair. As a cesspool of bribes, perjury, and further secret office affairs involving the deceased come to light, it becomes obvious that it won't be an open and shut case. Rusty's world gets turned upside down when the state looks at all the evidence and charge their man, one Rusty Savage. Andrew, Harrison Ford was at the top of his game going into the 90s. What stands out about his acting as Rusty?
He's not your typical tough guy Harrison Ford. When I think of all the movies I've seen of him, this is only the second one I can think of where he cries.
He gets pretty vulnerable in the 90s. We saw some of his Jack Ryan material, and he sheds a tear once or twice there. I want to say in The Fugitive, he cries.
Yeah, I don't remember him really crying too much in Jack Ryan, but I do remember The Fugitive. He was definitely a sad guy, really stressed out.
Yeah, in the 80s, he was Rick Deckard, Indiana Jones, Han Solo. They were all pretty macho. Pat, what do you think of Harrison Ford's acting?
I thought it was fine. It's just as good as he does in any other movie. I wasn't a huge fan of the movie itself, but I don't attribute that to his acting.
What was more interesting, the courtroom scenes of the second half or the initial investigation into Carolyn's murder?
I mean, I felt like the investigation was ongoing throughout the movie, because even as the trial was going on, you had Rusty's character still trying to investigate with the help of his friend from the police department. So I thought that was interesting. I thought it was all kind of intriguing, though, because typically you'll have drama in the courtroom, but you had the drama, but there was the corruption, the bribery stuff that was going on, as well as the weirdness of the investigation. Additionally, you had the flashbacks and stuff that were kicking in between court scenes, too. So it was jumbled in that sense. If I had to pick, I'd say the courtroom was more interesting.
Is that because you liked that in the latter half of the movie, Rusty was playing defense?
I think you could say that, yeah. I think it was also like the stakes are raised. Because the first half, you're trying to investigate to figure out who did it. Now it's presumed that we've got the guy, and we're trying to prove that this is the guy that did it. I think that's more interesting.
And it already starts so personal because he had an affair with her. It just ante-ups with him now being the main suspect. Andrew, were there any aspects of the filmmaking that you really liked?
The opening shot where it just zooms in on the juror chairs with the narration and ended that way and then kind of zoomed out, if I remember. To me, it felt like an older movie almost, like it was from the 70s or something. The movie is pretty 90s, but it had those little moments where it was like a hark back to the old times.
It gets soapy in the middle of it with how many people Carolyn slept with, that now that you mention it, with the bookends of zooming into the juror box and then zooming out at the end, because that feels so cold, especially with Harrison Ford's narration, it feels like it acts as a way to cool off the more melodramatic aspects of the story.
It kind of grounds it a little. Okay, like she was sleeping with Harrison Ford, and then she was sleeping with Brian Dennehy for some reason. She was sleeping with that judge at some point. She was played up as a woman who was most likely doing it just to get ahead in her career. Maybe that makes it more soap opera-y, but I think it needed those types of moments.
Pat, what was your favorite scene or performance?
It was a good star-studded cast in there. Bonnie Bedelia from Die Hard, Brian Dennehy, who's always a joy, the late, great John Spencer. Harrison Ford is probably my favorite performance because it was a different type of character for him. He was less likable than characters that you would normally see him play. You weren't really rooting for him per se. I didn't feel like I was, at least. He's somebody that I do enjoy a lot in a lot of films, so I thought it was interesting that you've got a character where you're kind of like, no, I'm not really endeared to this guy.
I might characterize Rusty as someone who is moving through the plot and he's reacting to things and things are happening to him and around him. Does that work for you? Do you wish he was more heroic or maybe came off more lascivious?
Not heroic for sure. I think as the audience, we're supposed to constantly suspect him. Also, in a way, all we really have to go off is he says he wasn't there, he was watching his kid, but there's a lot of physical evidence, phone logs and stuff. There's a lot of stuff that points to him doing this, which, is good for any type of wrongfully accused story. I think if he teetered either way a little bit more, the film would be telegraphing more of like, okay, he really is innocent, or no, this guy did it. Him being this really neutral dude, it helps the whole did he aspect of the story.
I enjoyed Raul Julia overall as Rusty's attorney, Sandy Stern, but my favorite scene didn't actually involve him. It was the confession at the very end. The actors in that scene did a lot while standing still, just playing reactions in that big monologue. It's one of those moments where you get super quiet because you don't want to miss a thing. For you, Andrew, was there another scene or performance you want to shout out?
I liked the courtroom scenes more than the investigation stuff. The beginning was kind of slow, but once they started doing the trial and all that jazz, yes, bring me the lawyer stuff. My favorite scene was when the medical examiner or coroner was on the stand and they caught him in this huge, really big boo-boo that essentially blew the case up. Raul was getting him, but he was so cool about it. Like, he was that perfect attorney character where he's just really cool as a cucumber the whole time. He seemed very caring, but he also was very calculated and knew exactly what he was doing. He's the type of lawyer that you would want in your corner.
Getting into criticisms, as much as I liked the confession scene, I thought they told too much going into the step-by-step of the killer's actions. It's a degree of detail where I can imagine the screenwriter said, I need to spell out the whole thing so the audience buys the twist. Almost like the killer was giving a PowerPoint presentation. If they were going to touch on everything to explain the way the murder happened, then at least throw in some flashbacks. I'm of two minds in that scene. I love the performances, but it's exposition city. Leave me with some dangling questions, and trust that I'll connect the dots after the killer's identity is revealed.
It throws out a red herring as to who it might be before the big confession. There's a moment where there's an object, and you're like, oh, okay, so that's what happened. It brought me back to the scene when the search warrant was being carried out, because there was like a very specific line of dialogue that stuck with me. And I thought, okay, well, that makes sense. It's kind of a throwaway dialogue. But then when you see the part at the ending, I was like, oh, that's cool. But the subsequent confession made discovering the object really weird. Lack of reaction to it. Pretty grisly discovery that someone finds and shrugs it off and goes about his day. Or their day. Or her day. You don't know how that got there. Would you really just be so chill about it? I know they had to have the suspense, but I feel like you could have had the discovery lead into the confession in a more natural way. It threw the whole thing off for me.
I see your perspective there. If I had any sort of defense of it, given the grayish relationship between the two characters at the end of the movie and one of them finding the murder weapon, I could see it as a foreshadowing of how they were ultimately going to react to finding out who did it. and that they wouldn't turn that person in. Maybe it's a way to show character consistency leading into the final reveal.
I was a little torn with the ending. I thought it was interesting when Raul Julia's character questioning whether or not his client is actually guilty. And that kind of paints that picture for the audience, too. It's like, did he actually do it? Or was it somebody else? Because there was a lot of things that were hard to explain if he didn't do it. It could have ended there, you know what I mean, with you don't know if he did it or not. But instead, yeah, we do get to reveal. That would have probably been a grumpy audience member if you don't actually reveal it. We do get the big reveal. But I agree with you, Frank, that I think there was a little too much detail. You don't need the monologue about this is exactly how I did it. Whatever. I think there's enough to connect the dots that was like, yeah, you did it for this reason. It makes sense. It would have been an interesting way to end it, for sure. You can narrow it down. You don't necessarily need to reveal it.
Over 80 episodes of The Screen Companion. Listen to the show on Podbean, Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, and more. Drop us a line via thescreencompanion@gmail.com or join the Facebook group. Tell us your favorite guests and what topics we should cover next. Further support the host by going on Amazon.com and picking up his 2 sci-fi novels, Self, Recognition, and Traversal, The Weight of Worlds, available in digital and print editions. So much of the movie exists in an ambiguous place, especially with people involved with the law. Andrew, do you think the movie's making any sort of comment on the legal system?
It probably is trying to. Most dramas or shows, any type of genre, I guess, that depict the legal system, they're going to have some type of comment on it, whether it's, hey, this is a fantastic American way of doing things, or it's going to be a bleak picture of it. This one tried to paint a realistic picture where it's not so much that the system itself isn't necessarily flawed. And when I say the system, I mean the rules and procedures and the letter of the law, but it is the people who carry it out. There's a lot of technicalities. The detective hiding the glass, he's like, oh, if they asked me, I would have presented it, but they never asked. It's like, you hid evidence, dude. But, I mean, he could rely on that technicality, wash his hands of it. The case was transferred from him while he was in possession of the glass, so it was okay for him to stash it in a drawer. It's the people who bring the issues into the system. People have prejudice and people have motives, but not words on the paper.
I think everybody involved in all these movies either did something illegal or unethical.
I would agree with that. Yeah, I'd say 12 Angry Men is probably the closest to most procedural.
We'll get to that.
We will get to that, but yeah, I think there's problems with the way that all of it is done, for sure. It does highlight the flaws in the legal system, how pretty evident throughout the film as you see mistake after mistake being made.
I think the only one that straight out perjures himself is Brian Dennehy.
Yeah, he commits perjury.
Everybody else, they kind of ride that line or they're negligent. Dennehy, he just flat out looks at Rusty and says, I'm going to testify you said these things that never happened.
B-file cases, cases involving bribery and official misconduct, are normally assigned to the assistant deputy, at the time Mr. Savage. Is that not true?
That was the usual practice, yes, sir.
You gave this highly sensitive matter in this B-file to Carolyn Telemus while you were sleeping with her?
It appears to be the time frame. The answer to the question is yes.
And were you not concerned, sir, in the midst of a nip-and-tuck election campaign about word leaking out that you had secretly given a file that was in Mr. Savage's area of authority to an assistant with no experience in such matters with whom you were sleeping at the time?
May have crossed my mind. Who knows, Mr. Stern? It was not an ideal situation.
Far from it. And, sir, you come to this courtroom where the life of a man who served you faithfully for 12 years, now hangs in the balance, and you tell us that you withheld evidence from him that might have assisted in his investigation?
I can't think of a single movie where Brian Dennehy was a nice guy, so I wasn't surprised.
Tommy Boy, 1995.
Exactly, Pat, thank you.
I haven't seen it.
It's excellent.
I swear to God, Pat, I would have bet $1 million you were going to say Tommy Boy. Getting into a general discussion about legal movies for a second, I just want a simple yes or no. Do you, for the most part, like court movies?
Yes.
Yes.
What are some of your favorite tropes involving court movies?
I love the surprise witness, although that would almost never happen. I love a good surprise witness or surprise piece of evidence.
You got that in My Cousin Vinny.
I did, yeah. And I like how animated the attorneys can get. When you watch real court proceedings, it's really not that interesting. They usually just stand behind a podium or they just stand up and they don't move around the courtroom. They don't take up the space. They don't do all this stuff. It really glamorizes it, and I think that's what's cool.
On the flip side of that, Pat, are there court movie tropes that get on your nerves?
Yelling in the courtroom or just being overly obnoxious and dramatic is definitely one of the ones that drives me crazy.
Let's say you don't know that they're portraying the law inaccurately in a film. Are you fine with it as long as the story was good?
I think so, yeah. I mean, they say ignorance is bliss, so I would agree with that.
Andrew, tell us about 12 Angry Men.
A story about 12 jurors who have to decide whether a young man is guilty of murder, premeditated, and it's an automatic execution. A man's life hangs in the balance, and it's up to them to figure it out.
Pat, which juror did you identify with the most?
I wouldn't say Henry Fonda. I'd say Jack Warden, the juror who had the baseball tickets and he didn't want to be there, wanted to just get out.
Why is it, when they do this type of story, especially in television, there's always that juror that needs to be somewhere and they just want to get it over with? And it's always a sports thing. Why can't they have some upper crust a-hole say, I got to go to the opera tonight. Can we move this along? Why's it got to be the salt of the earth guy?
I think it's because it's more relatable. Because if you're watching a movie and you're like, oh, I got tickets to the game tonight, especially if it's like the World Series or something like that, a lot of people could relate to that. Like, oh man, if it was my team in the World Series, I'd absolutely want to be there. Versus like, this schmuck's going to go to the opera. You can't relate to that. How many times have you been like, oh, I have tickets to the opera tonight, and like, I can't miss that?
Yeah, I think if it was like an upper crusty thing, the average viewer would be like, oh, this guy thinks he's better than everyone, wants to leave faster. Like, as soon as it's a rich person thing, you hate them. So it has to be a ball game.
All right, I'll give it reasonable doubt and say they're playing that for relatability and not taking a dig at the working class. Andrew, what feels especially 50s about this flick?
Absolutely the dialogue. Almost everything Henry Fonda says is out of like a 40s, 50s movies playbook. They ask him a direct question, and he's like, I don't know, maybe he did it, maybe he didn't do it, but that's what we're here for. It's like just stuff like that I love about these old movies.
As the only juror at the start of the movie that says not guilty, how would you describe Fonda's character?
He seems very cool and calm, and even the way he dresses is different. I think everyone else in the room had a dark suit jacket, but Henry Fonda has this white suit jacket. He seems already more suave. They made him a little less sweaty than everyone else. So he was just cool as a cucumber.
What do you think about the film skipping the actual trial and spending 99% of the picture in the deliberation room?
You're coming into a story in the middle, so you've missed the beginning of the story, and it's up to the jurors to catch you up on that. They've got to catch us up on why they think he's guilty. everything related to the case. So it's really interesting and kind of a slow build.
Have either of you guys ever served on a jury?
No.
I have not.
Have you been called to a jury pool?
I was once. It was kind of weird. They called 13 of us from the room, and then they called 12 names, and I was the only person who wasn't being asked questions, and then I just had to go back to the jury room. But it was cool to see that process and what people will say to get out of jury duty.
I've gotten summoned probably 6 times. It's obscene.
Damn.
And then my twin brother has been summoned exactly 0 times. So I think I get all of his summons or something. I don't know. I've definitely been excused a few times where it's just like you call and you never have to go in. I had to go in one time in California. I got there, they're like, fill out this form. And then as soon as I was done like filling out the form, they're like, oh, the case just settled. Everybody can go home. And then I almost got called in here in Oregon. I think it was the day before I was supposed to go in, and once again it was called off. It was like, oh, you don't have to come in.
That would be such an amazing prank if your brother whited out his first name and wrote in yours. And you call him up, it's like, geez, you won't believe it, man, I got called again. And he's laughing.
Maniacal laugh.
I mean, what's the point of having a twin brother unless you can pull stuff like that?
Good point.
So I've been in that big room waiting to see if I was going to be assigned to a jury. And if they were to make a prequel of this film, they should make a comedy of just all those losers sitting in that room, hoping to God they don't get called up.
There's a show on Amazon Prime called Jury Duty. They take like one real guy and everybody else is an actor in the entire room. And then they put this guy on the jury with 11 actors. And the trial's fake and everything's fake, but he has no idea. It's pretty good.
Yeah, that has James Marsden.
It does. James Marsden plays James Marsden, and it's hysterical.
I just remember I hit on a girl while I was there, and she said she was impressed, but she already had a boyfriend. That's my contribution to the legal process. Andrew, what was your favorite scene or performance?
I feel like it's one of the best scenes in cinema of a guy completely making an ass of himself. I think it was juror number 10, just starts going off about those people and how bad they are. But he'll be the first to admit that they have some good ones. But really, guys, you can't believe them. And then all the other jurors get up and walk away and ignore him like he's a 5-year-old. And then he just kind of like stops and then walks over to the corner and sits and just reflects on his life.
And then you notice how once he leaves the table, the other jurors start coming back.
Yeah, exactly. You just ignore them.
It was effective to me, but that's where I saw between the lines, and it really came off as a play in that moment.
It's a pretty dramatic movie for a movie that has almost like so little drama, if you know what I mean. It's hard to describe. So it wasn't like there was dramatic scenes or explosions or anything like that, but there was a lot of dramatic acting. It's funny when you've got the juror number 3 who just refuses to change his mind, and he's very stubborn in his ways. I think it's juror number 3, and Henry Fonda's like, are you his executioner? You want to pull the trigger yourself? That's the famous scene, obviously. I think that was pretty funny.
Is juror 3 the very last holdout?
Yeah, he is.
Okay, yeah. What's your biggest criticism, Andrew?
I don't know. I mean, like, to me, it's almost one of those, like, rare, perfect movies. I really do have a hard time finding a criticism.
Oh, I've got one.
Oh, I'm listening. Go ahead.
When he walks with the limp across the room to demonstrate a point.
Oh, yeah.
It's very overly dramatic.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me elaborate on that. And then I'll give you a chance at rebuttal, Andrew.
Okay.
One of the pieces of evidence is that the downstairs neighbor, who's a witness, had heard the shot fired and then heard the body hit the floor. And he walked to his front door, and as he opened his door, he saw the suspect running away. The man on trial running away. So that was a key piece of evidence for the jury to consider. But the one thing that they had noticed was this guy walked with a limp. They had the floor plan of his apartment. They measured out that it was approximately 50 feet that he'd have to go to get to the front door. He testified that it took him like 12 seconds or something like that to walk to the door. So Henry Fonda very dramatically drags his foot the entire time to walk the supposed 50 feet. It was a very long sequence.
If you're having mobility issues, you can totally recreate it by just dragging your foot. If I can build off of that, and forgive me, Andrew, this is going to be a long paragraph, but I will give you a chance to respond. For me, I thought Henry Fonda, as the sole juror at the beginning that votes not guilty, he came off so righteous, and I think the movie has an anti-death penalty stance with the way the biggest holdouts to the not guilty are the two biggest bigots in the room. The amount of work Fonda does to change the other jurors' votes, from recreating testimonies like CSI, as Pat just mentioned there, to bringing in his own evidence, the knife, boggles my mind, and I can't help think he overstepped his legal duty as a juror. But the movie clearly wants us to see him as the one we should be rooting for. And if that's the case, then I think it would have been better if we got to see the defendant being unjustly persecuted in the courtroom at the front of the movie before the jurors went to deliberate. That way, it sends Fonda on a clear moral imperative to save the defendant's life and to bring us into that goal with him. But they shorthanded it, giving us a sympathetic music cue and a close-up of the defendant just prior to the story beginning. I lost a little faith in the movie. I wanted it to be more ambiguous and for us to discover it along with the jurors. But that tell with the sympathy music, it's like, okay, so I'm already supposed to not think that this guy did it.
I think you're wrong. No, I don't. That's a tough one. It's a tough one because I feel like all of your points are extremely valid. I believe that this comes down to taste. I think that...
Oh, definitely. None of the criticisms we talk about are ever meant to blanket everybody, but I think a particular subgroup of the audience might feel this way.
And I agree with you, because I can understand when I think of movies, I rarely think of what could have been expanded on, and I usually think of what could have been cut. It seems to me like you kind of think of more of expanding in listening to this podcast as well. The music was kind of sad from the get-go, I think. And then to see the guy whimpering and sad, you could have a scene like the closing arguments where you have the attorneys kind of sum up the facts. And then you can see the guy, maybe you could have the prosecutor point at him, this guy stabbed his dad in cold blood and he's an awful guy, and then it shows him and he's rattled, and then his defense attorney does a closing statement and he sits down, and then the prosecution, they get a redirect anyway, so they get another chance to yell at this kid. I think that could help, and it would set up Henry Fonda as more of like the clear hero. Yeah, him bringing a knife was like, okay, I get it. Clearly you're reaching. That does go above and beyond. But if you didn't commit a crime and you're about to get the chair, wouldn't you want a juror who is like that? I completely agree with you that this movie probably is very anti-death penalty, because they take it with such seriousness, but at the same time, they should take it with that utmost seriousness. Visually, they set Henry Fonda apart from everyone else. The most put together, because it's also Henry Fonda, but still.
He's the White Knight Crusader.
Yeah, he's wearing the white suit, the all-white suit. He is the Crusader of the movie. Does it telegraph that he's 100% innocent? Maybe not. I think Casey Anthony cried during her trial, so, you know, people cry.
Fonda is so diligently in support of the defendant that I've seen one or two theories that posit that Fonda is that kid's guardian angel. I want to lean in that direction because it would fix the whole movie for me. Because most of the time, I'm just thinking to myself, Jesus, Henry Fonda just really doesn't want to see that kid go to the chair, to the point where he's conducting the whole trial again in the deliberation room. Pat, what do you think of the way they portray the law in the film?
We open with the judge's instructions to the jury, and I think it's fairly well done. We see Henry Fonda being aggressively, he really doesn't even state, he knows if the kid is innocent or not. He just states that they should take longer than 5 minutes to decide. I think that's really well done. And I think it's good, too, that we don't have any true misconduct amongst the jurors. Yes, you have him bringing the knife in. Usually, jury instruction is to, don't investigate the crime on your own time or something like that, because they want you to only have the evidence that's presented to you by the court. Investigators are supposed to do evidence, and same with the defense and everything like that. I think that's the only questionable part, but it's not too terribly bad, in my opinion.
Before we move on to some lighter fare with My Cousin Vinny, I have to point out something that had me so perturbed. When Henry Fonda is grilling the dude with the glasses, and the guy with the glasses, a sticking point for him is that the defendant, when questioned shortly after the murder, couldn't recall what movie he saw or who was in it as his alibi.
I'll take the testimony of the policeman who interrogated the boy right after the murder, but he couldn't remember a thing about the movies, great emotional stress or not. Where were you last night? I was home. How about the night before that? Come on, what is this? No, it's all right. I left the office at 8:30 and went straight home and to bed. The night before that? That was Tuesday nights, the night of the bridge tournament. I played bridge Monday night.
When you get down on New Year's Eve 1954, let me know, right?
Monday night, my wife and I went to the movies.
What did you see?
The Scarlet Circle. It was a very clever whodunit. What was the second feature? I'll tell you in a minute. The remarkable Mrs. Mrs. Bainbridge. The remarkable Mrs. Bainbridge.
I saw that. It's called The Amazing Mrs. Bainbridge.
Yes, The Amazing Mrs. Bainbridge. I think that's right.
And you weren't under an emotional stress, were you?
No, I wasn't.
See? Mr. Fonda has a point. And I'm thinking, yeah, but you went 3 days. If you keep going back, eventually the guy's not going to be able to answer you. That's not the same thing as the defendant. But maybe I was the only one that didn't enjoy that.
That is weird inconsistency. It is weird that you wouldn't remember the movie that you saw that night. But I think the point he was trying to make also was that this kid was beaten by his father a bit, so he was probably pretty rattled. At the end of the day, it's not like that line of questioning was really... It wasn't that helpful to Henry Fonda's point, because that's not what turned the glasses juror.
Our final movie of the night. Pat, what's the story of My Cousin Vinny?
Great movie from the early 90s. And the premise is that you have two young men on a road trip down through the deep south, and they're in Alabama, and they stop at a convenience store to buy some groceries. And one of the boys pockets a can of tuna by accident, grabs it, his hands are full, he puts it in his pocket, leaves the store, realizes he didn't pay for the tuna. And then a few miles down the road, the police catch up with him and pull guns on him and take him to jail. They are actually being charged with murder because the clerk of the store was murdered. So they're on trial for murder, and they need an attorney. So one of the boys hires his cousin Vinny as his attorney.
And that lawyer from New York, Vinny, so he hasn't been in court once?
Yeah, we come to find out that, has he not passed the bar? Or he did pass the bar, but he's never practiced before. Never had a trial. He's studying throughout the movie during the trial. He's learning how a trial works, trying to defend these two kids. And it's a comedy of errors.
Andrew, how does Joe Pesci's Vinny stack up against other movie lawyers?
Bumbles a lot. He's more comedic, because most of the time movie attorneys, generally courtroom dramas, not courtroom comedies. He's very unique in that sense, where he's played up for laughs. He's not Atticus Finch. He's Vinny.
It almost feels grossly irresponsible for him to take the case, considering what's at stake.
Yeah, but doing family a favor.
Besides the comedy, I think part of what plays into the court-appointed defense attorney that comes in for not Ralph Macchio, the cousin of Vinny, but the other kid involved. They made that attorney a stuttering fool during the actual trial, just so that you would feel a little bit better about Vinny and say, well, you know, Vinny might not have any experience, but at least he's not this guy. I would like to read an excerpt from the back of My Cousin Vinny Laserdisc that I have.
Of course.
The central idea for My Cousin Vinny presented itself to screenwriter and co-producer Dale Launer when he learned from a law school friend that it's actually possible for an aspiring lawyer to flunk his or her bar exams repeatedly and just keep on plugging away till they get it right. It struck me as funny, says Launer. Imagine that you have been erroneously arrested for murder and you learn that the only lawyer you can get flunked the bar exam 12 times. Pat, what do you think of the ratio of comedy to drama?
There's definitely more comedy. It's definitely built to be a comedy, but it definitely is not without its dramatic moments, which I think is good. There's a scene, I think, when the two guys are in jail for the night and they're arguing about whether they should keep Vinny as their lawyer or not, and then the lights start to flicker because somebody's getting put to death and they know that that could be them. So I think it does a great job at finding that balance, but still being on the lighter side of things.
And Andrew, what did you like more, the out-of-court stuff between Vinny and Mona, or the court proceedings in the latter half of the movie?
I'd say the court proceedings in the latter half.
And did any of the technical stuff like costumes, lighting, set design stick out?
For costumes, of course, like anything that Mona was wearing was just so hardcore. Those are some outfits.
I remember she wore one very loud red outfit in court.
She was always dressed to the nines. You know, it's Marissa Tomei, so she pulls it off beautifully. Those costumes stuck out. Vinny's suit in the first day of trial, hilarious. Vinny always looked more like a gangster at the beginning, but of course, you know, it's Joe Pesci. You have to associate him with gangster flicks.
So, Pat, what was your favorite scene or performance?
Marissa Tomei's favorite performance, because she did win the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress for this film, and she's just so excellent in that. In terms of favorite scene, he's disproving some of the witnesses. Like, they're not bad people per se, but he's proving that maybe you missed something or maybe you didn't time it correctly. It's like with the gentleman cooking the grits. That's a pretty great scene because it shows how smart Vinny is as a person and how he thinks about these sorts of things. But it also demonstrates the fallibility of the witnesses and how people do just make mistakes.
And the amount of comedy of errors that happens in this movie toward the beginning, when the college kids are waiting for their lawyer and they've just talked about the dangers of being sexually assaulted in prison. And then a CO brings Vinny into the room. His cousin's friend, who doesn't recognize Vinny, thinks he's there to assault him. Just all the innuendo as Vinny's talking about the case, but the kid thinks it's all related to butt sex.
Yeah, that's a great scene.
That is a fantastic scene. Absolutely.
You must be staying. How you doing?
Why'd they bring you in here?
Well, I just got in. I asked where the new guys were, and they brought me right in. Hey, sleeping, huh? Cute little guy. You know, maybe I'll just start with you. I'll let him sleep a little bit.
I don't want to do this.
Hey, I don't blame you. If I was in your situation, I'd want to get through this whole thing as quickly and with as little pain as possible. So, you know, let's try our best to make it a simple in and out procedure. What's the matter? Relax. You know, maybe we should spend a couple of minutes together, you know, to get acquainted before we get to it. What's wrong with you?
I don't want to do this.
But I understand, but, you know, what are your alternatives?
My alternatives?
Yeah.
To what, to you? I don't know. Suicide, death?
Look, it's either me or them. You're getting fucked one way or the other. Hey. Lighten up, okay? Don't worry, I'm gonna help you. Gee, thanks. Excuse me, but I think a modicum of gratitude would not be out of line here.
You think I should be grateful?
Yeah. I mean, it's your ass, not mine. I think you should be grateful. I think you should be down on your fucking knees.
I'm sorry. I didn't know it was such an honor to get a visit from you.
Hey, I'm doing a favor here, you know. You're getting me for nothing, you little fuck.
Boy, that's one hell of an ego you've got.
What the fuck is your problem? I did not come down here just to get jerked off, you know.
No. I'm not jerking you off. I'm not doing anything.
That's it. You're on your own. I'm just taking care of Sleeper Beauty. Hey, Billy.
Hey, back off. Vinny. Hey, Vinny. Vinny. Vinny Bag of Donuts. How are you? This is Vinny.
Was this your first time seeing this film, Frank?
Yes, it was.
Did you enjoy it?
I'll say in the same way I felt about 12 Angry Men, I enjoyed being able to cross it off my list. Both movies, I've always thought, there's enough buzz around it. One of these days I'll see it. And My Cousin Vinny, I do have it on Laserdisc, so it was nice to be able to bust it out. But the comedy, there was so much comedy in it, it was off-putting to me. But I'll get into that with the criticisms. Before we get there, Andrew, how about you? Notable scenes or performances besides what we've mentioned?
The witnesses being cross-examined. I like the one where he was getting on that guy's case for having dirty windows and screens and the trees and the bushes. You can see the shame on the guy's face that his dirty-ass windows were brought in photographs to the court.
Yes, would you look in this photo, sir, and tell me, what are those bushy-looking things? Bushes? That's right.
Just shout them out when you know them.
Is it possible the two defendants entered the store, picked 22 specific items off of the shelves, had the clerk take money, make change, then leave? Then two different men drive up in a similar... Don't shake your head, I'm not done yet. Wait till you hear the whole thing so you can understand this now. Two different men drive up in a similar-looking car, go in, shoot the clerk, rob him, and then leave?
No. They didn't have enough time.
Well, how much time was they in the store?
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Are you sure? Did you look at your watch?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. You testified earlier that the boys went into the store and you had just begun to make breakfast. You were just ready to eat and you heard a gunshot. That's right, I'm sorry. So obviously it takes you 5 minutes to make breakfast.
That's right.
Right, so you knew that. Do you remember what you had?
Eggs and grits.
Eggs and grits. I like grits too. How do you cook your grits? You like them regular, creamy, or al dente?
Just regular, I guess.
Regular. Instant grits?
No self-respecting Southerner uses instant grits. I take pride in my grits.
So, Mr. Tipton, how could it take you 5 minutes to cook your grits when it takes the entire grit-eating world 20 minutes?
I don't know. I'm a fast cook, I guess.
I'm sorry, I was all the way over here. I couldn't hear you. Did you say you're a fast cook? That's it? Are we to believe that boiling water soaks into a grit faster in your kitchen than on any place on the face of the earth?
I don't know.
Well, perhaps the laws of physics cease to exist on your stove. Were these magic grits?
Andrew, what criticism would you give My Cousin Vinny?
I'd say it's kind of long for a comedy movie. If anything, though, I could always use more Herman Munster. He was a great old Southern judge.
That's a trope that I'm not too fond of with legal movies, and I understand why it has to be this way. 99% of the time, the judge is ornery or he's very stiff. When you're casting for it, the lawyers can usually be flamboyant, but rarely do you get a really interesting judge character. But I feel like Fred Gwynne, he did the most with what was there. He didn't play too much of a Southern stereotype.
That's the problem with judge characters, I think, in any legal drama, honestly. The ideal judge is a total stick in the mud and just a stickler for rules, because that's really all they're good for. Like, the lawyers can argue all they want, but they have to stay on topic, and you have to keep it to the matters at hand and follow procedures, and that's kind of just what the judge is there for. I liked a lot of the interplay between Vinny and the judge, where Vinny would say something and it would do a close-up of the judge's face. You could tell he's annoyed and he wants to say something, but none of the rules were broken, so he just kind of like got to eat it, you know?
Do you think My Cousin Vinny has a closer comedy tone to the previous decade from it, the 80s, or do you think this is rooted in 90s comedy like Weekend at Bernie's?
Isn't Weekend at Bernie's an 80s movie?
89.
It's more rooted in the 80s comedies, because when I think of 90s comedies, I think of more physical comedy. You know, whether it's like kind of gross out comedy or maybe not physical comedy like the actor's doing something, it's sight gags. The first Austin Powers just has tons, might be dumber. 80s movies, comedies, almost all of the humor is found in the dialogue, where if it's a more serious situation, it's the dialogue that moves it forward and makes it funny, like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Just the bad luck that Steve Martin has. Yeah, I think this is more of like an 80s comedy where the dialogue is what drives the humor.
More character-oriented?
It's the people that are funny, it's not the situation, where I think the 90s switches more to the situation is funny. Or the characters are dialed up to 11. Like Happy Gilmore, it's just everything's over the top. It's not really a super believable situation at all. Or Billy Madison. That's kind of what I think of.
I guess that's why I would put Weekend at Bernie's in more of the 90s category, because that is so situation-based for its humor. More hijinks happen in 90s comedies. It's less about character dialogue, interactions per se. How about you, Pat? Even though you picked this one, is there any criticism you could give My Cousin Vinny?
I think the only thing that is glossed over, once again, it is a comedy, is that if Vinny is found out by the judge, which we think might happen at the end of the movie, is that a mistrial could be declared and these guys could go back on trial for their lives. So I think that's my only criticism, is that that's very much glossed over, not even really stated, like what would happen if he's revealed to not really have a proper law license.
Yeah, similar to that. The lack of seriousness Vinny puts into representing his cousin and the other kid in the first half of the story bugged me. So much of the Vinny character is silly. I needed him anchored by at least the gravity of what'll happen to them if they're found guilty. And not half an hour or an hour in, I need him to have already realized it by the time he drives down to Alabama from New York. That's not a short drive. Plenty of time to understand how serious it is. Andrew, do you have any final words of the movies we've discussed tonight?
I really liked all three. I think these were some solid choices.
Somebody is going to have a movie night with these three. What order would you say they should watch them in?
Probably watch them in the order we talked about them. I think the idea of just ending on a comedy is a nice palate cleanser. If I wanted it to end on a high note, you end on My Cousin Vinny. If I wanted it to end on a classic, I would end it with 12 Angry Men and have Cousin Vinny be the palate cleanser in the middle.
I might start with 12 Angry Men because it's the most dramatic.
You've reached the end of this episode of The Screen Companion. Thank you for listening.